I learned to kill before I learned to read. Let me tell you what that means, truly means, in the depths of a hive city where the sun is a myth told by those who dwell in the upper spires, and childhood is a concept as foreign as mercy or rest, or the simple expectation that tomorrow might be different from today. I was born in the underhive of Vulgaris Primus, in a hab block so deep beneath the surface that the weight of the city above us was a physical presence, a constant pressure that made the walls groan and the ceilings bool and the air taste of recycled desperation. My mother died giving birth to me. My father was a number in a manufactorum ledger, a worker who had been ground to paste in the machinery 3 months before my birth. His death noted only because it required the reassignment of his production quota to another interchangeable body. I was an orphan before I drew my first breath. This was not unusual. This was not tragedy. This was simply how things were in the depths of Vulgaris, where children were not raised but manufactured, not through the vat-born processes of more sophisticated worlds, but through the crude and brutal machinery of necessity, through systems designed to transform the endless surplus of underhive births into useful material for an imperium that hungered for bodies the way furnaces hunger for fuel. I was collected by the Schola Laborum within hours of my mother's death, pulled from her cooling arms by hands that did not bother to be gentle because gentleness was inefficient, logged into a system that would track my development and training and eventual deployment with the same dispassion that it tracked the output of ore refineries and the consumption of nutritional paste. I was given a number. I was given a bunk. I was given a purpose. The Schola Laborum was not a school in any sense that citizens of softer worlds would recognize. It was a factory, a processing facility, a machine designed to take the raw material of underhive children and refine us into products that the Imperium could use. Workers for the manufactorums, soldiers for the Astra Militarum, servitors for those deemed insufficiently capable of higher function, corpses for the recycling vats that fed the protein farms that fed the billions who dwelt in the levels above us. We were sorted and assessed and categorized from our earliest moments, subjected to tests that measured our reflexes and our aggression and our capacity for obedience, separated into tracks that would determine everything about the brief and brutal lives that awaited us. I was placed in the Militarum track. I was 4 years old. I do not remember much of those early years. Do not retain clear memories of the specific lessons or the individual instructors or the faces of the other children who shared my dormitory and my training and my slow transformation from infant to instrument. What I remember is sensation. The cold of the metal floors against bare feet, the ache of cigar muscles pushed beyond their limits, the taste of blood in my mouth from the beatings that followed any failure to meet the standards that had been established for our cohort. I remember learning to run before I could walk properly, learning to fight before I understood what fighting meant, learning to obey before I had developed the capacity for independent thought that might allow me to question the orders I was given. They did not break us. You cannot break what has never been whole. They simply shaped us, molded us, carved away everything that was not useful, and left behind only the parts that could be aimed and fired and expended in the Emperor's service. By the time I was 6 years old, I could strip and reassemble a laser gun in under 30 seconds. By the time I was 8, I had killed my first human being. A training exercise, they called it, though the man who died beneath my knife was real enough, a criminal condemned by the Arbites and delivered to the Schola as practice material for children learning the art of ending lives. I remember his eyes, wide with terror, as my blade found his throat, and I remember feeling nothing at all, because feeling had been trained out of me along with everything else that might interfere with function. This was not cruelty. This was efficiency. Across the breadth of the Imperium, I know now, billions of children were being processed through similar systems. Not all of them as harsh as the Schola Laborum of Volgores, but all of them serving the same purpose, all of them feeding the same endless hunger that the Imperium feels for bodies to fill its armies and its manufactorums and its ships and its graves. We were not special. We were not chosen. We were simply the surplus population of a civilization so vast that it counted its citizens in numbers too large for human minds to comprehend. A civilization that had learned across 10,000 years of desperate survival that sentimentality about children was a luxury it could not afford. I was 12 years old when they shipped us off-world for the first time. The transport that carried us was a bulk hauler, retrofitted for troop movement, its holds packed with 10,000 child soldiers from a dozen different schola across Volgoris Primus, all of us bound for a war zone whose name we were not permitted to know. I remember standing in the observation deck during our departure, watching the Hive world shrink behind us, seeing for the first time the true scale of the city that had been my entire universe. Spires rising so high that they pierced the clouds, sprawls spreading so far that the horizon curved before the city ended, lights glittering like stars across a surface that held more human beings than I could have counted if I had spent my entire life doing nothing but counting. I felt nothing. I had been trained to feel nothing. But somewhere beneath the training, beneath the conditioning, beneath the carefully constructed absence of emotion that the scholar had instilled in me from my earliest memories, something stirred, something that recognized the magnitude of what I was leaving behind, something that understood on a level deeper than thought that I would never return to this place, that the life I had known in the Underhive was ending and something else was beginning, something that would be either better or worse, but would certainly be different in ways I could not predict. I did not know then that I would spend the next 30 years fighting on worlds whose names I would forget, killing enemies whose nature I would never understand, serving an imperium that did not know my name and would not care if it did. I did not know that I would watch thousands of my cohort siblings die around me, their bodies falling in trenches and hab blocks, and the burning streets of cities that looked exactly like the one we had left behind. I did not know that survival itself would become my curse, that living through battles that killed everyone around me would eventually force me to ask questions that children raised in the schola were never supposed to ask. I knew only that the transport was moving, that Volgoris was shrinking, that the Emperor required my service and I had been built from birth to provide it. I was 12 years old. I was a weapon. I was ready to be fired. Let me tell you what came next. The wars and the deaths and the slow awakening of something that should have been killed in me before it ever had a chance to grow. Let me tell you what it costs to be raised as ammunition, to be shaped from infancy into an instrument of violence, to discover only after decades of service that the humanity they tried to carve out of you cannot be fully removed, only buried, only suppressed, only hidden in depths so dark that you yourself forget it exists until something happens that drags it screaming back into the light. Let me tell you what it means to be a child soldier of the Imperium. Let me tell you why I am no longer certain that I survived. The first world they sent us to was called Carthex Minoris. I remember the name because it was the first name I was ever permitted to know, the first word that connected to a place outside the processing systems and training facilities that had been my entire existence until that point. Carthex Minoris. A hive world like Volgoris, though smaller, older, its spires crumbling beneath the weight of centuries of neglect, and the more recent weight of an insurrection that had been burning through its lower levels for 3 years before our transport entered orbit. The rebels were called something, had some ideology or grievance or cause that had driven them to take up arms against the Imperium's authority. But we were not told what it was. We were not told because it did not matter. Enemies were enemies. Targets were targets. The reasons behind the killing were irrelevant to the killing itself. We descended through ash-choked skies in dropships that shuddered and groaned with the strain of atmospheric entry, packed so tightly into the transport holds that I could feel the heartbeats of the children pressed against me on every side, could smell their sweat and their fear and the particular chemical odor of the stimulants that had been administered to ensure we would be alert and aggressive upon landing. I was 12 years old. The girl beside me was 11. The boy on my other side might have been 13, though it was hard to tell. The scholar did not celebrate birthdays or track ages with any precision beyond what was necessary for determining when a cohort was ready for deployment. We were weapons. Weapons do not have ages. Weapons have calibers and conditions and ammunition counts, and we had been loaded and aimed and were about to be fired. The ramp dropped. The war swallowed us whole. I cannot describe to you what it is like to experience combat for the first time at the age of 12. Cannot find words sufficient to capture the overwhelming assault on senses that had been trained for this moment, but had never actually experienced it in its full and terrible reality. The noise was the first thing, not the sounds of individual weapons, not the discrete reports of laser guns and autoguns, and the heavier thump of crew-served weapons in the distance, but a wall of sound so continuous and so all-encompassing that it ceased to be noise at all and became simply the texture of existence, the medium through which all other experience was filtered. The smell was the second thing, smoke and blood, and the particular stench of human bodies opened by violence, of viscera exposed to air, of fear, sweat and voided bowels, and the chemical sweetness of lace burns on flesh. The sights came last, my eyes slower to process than my ears and my nose, my brain struggling to make sense of the chaos that unfolded before me as I stumbled down the ramp and into a street that had become an abattoir. Bodies everywhere. Not just the enemy dead, not just the rebels we had been sent to kill, but our own children in the same uniforms I wore, carrying the same weapons I carried, their faces frozen in expressions that ranged from terror to confusion to a strange and terrible blankness that suggested they had died before their minds could process what was happening to them. I stepped over them, stepped on them when I could not avoid it, my boots squelching in fluids I refused to identify, my laser gun up and tracking for targets because that was what I had been trained to do. And the training was all that remained when everything else had been stripped away by the overwhelming reality of my first engagement. I killed my first enemy soldier within 90 seconds of deployment. He was young, not a child, but young, perhaps 17 or 18. His face twisted with rage as he charged our position with a stub pistol in one hand and a makeshift blade in the other. I did not think. I did not aim in any conscious sense. My body simply performed the actions that had been drilled into it across years of training. The laser gun rising, the trigger depressing, the bolt of coherent light punching through his chest and dropping him mid-stride, his momentum carrying his corpse forward until it slid to a stop at my feet, with smoke rising from the hole I had burned through his heart. I felt nothing. This was what I had been made for. The battle lasted 6 hours. My cohort, 200 children who had trained together since we were old enough to hold weapons, was reduced to 63 by the time the firing stopped. I watched them die around me with the same detachment I had felt when killing the enemy, noting their falls the way I might note the expenditure of ammunition, tracking losses without allowing those losses to become anything more than tactical information that might affect my own survival. Mira 7 fell to a grenade that detonated at her feet, her body shredded into components that scattered across the rubble in patterns I can still see when I close my eyes. Kyle 12 was shot through the head by a sniper we never identified, his skull coming apart in a spray of bone and brain matter that painted the wall behind him in colors I had not known the human body contained. Sev 3, the boy who had stood beside me in the transport, simply disappeared. One moment he was there, fighting beside me, and the next he was gone, pulled into a drainage culvert by hands I did not see, his screams echoing up from the darkness for nearly a minute before they finally stopped. I did not mourn them. I had not been built for mourning. But I noted their numbers. I carried them with me, the designations of the fallen, adding them to a list that I maintained in my head because we had not been provided with journals or recording devices, because the Shola had not anticipated that any of us would want to remember the dead. Mira 7, Kyle 12, Sev 3. And all the others, all the children who had been processed alongside me and shipped across the stars and expended on a world whose name I would carry forever, even as the Imperium forgot that any of us had ever existed. The campaign on Carthex Minoris lasted 11 months. We were reinforced twice during that period, fresh cohorts arriving from other scholar on other worlds to replace the losses that accumulated with each engagement, each street battle, each bloody room-clearing operation in the cramped hab blocks where the rebels had made their final stands. I watched the new arrivals with eyes that had aged decades in the span of months, saw in their faces the same blankness that I had worn when I first descended that dropship ramp, recognized in their movements the mechanical precision of training that had not yet been tempered by the chaos of actual combat. Some of them would survive, most of them would not. This was the mathematics of the militarum, the cold calculus that governed the expenditure of human resources on scales too vast for individual minds to comprehend. I survived. I always survived. By the time the insurrection was declared suppressed and our regiment was withdrawn for redeployment, I was one of 17 original members of my cohort who remained alive and functional. 17 out of 200. The others had been killed or wounded severely enough to be processed for servitor conversion, or broken in ways that the commissariat deemed unacceptable and corrected with a bolt round to the base of the skull. I had lost nothing except the ability to remember a time before the war, the capacity to imagine an existence that did not involve the constant presence of violence and death and the need to be ready at every moment to kill or be killed. I was 13 years old. I was a veteran, and somewhere in the depths of my conditioning, beneath the layers of training and suppression, and the systematic destruction of everything that might interfere with function, something had begun to stir. Something that noted the names of the fallen, not merely as tactical information, but as something else. Something that felt almost like loss, almost like grief, almost like the distant echo of an emotion that I had been told I was incapable of experiencing. I did not understand this stirring. I did not have the vocabulary to describe it or the framework to analyze it. I knew only that when I lay in my bunk during the brief rest periods between engagements, when the noise of the war faded enough that I could hear my own thoughts, the names would come to me unbidden. Mira 7, Kyle 12, Sev 3, and all the others. And something in my chest would tighten in a way that the scholar's training had not prepared me to address. I told no one. Speaking of such things would have marked me as defective, as a malfunction requiring correction. I simply carried the names in silence, adding to them with each deployment, each campaign, each world that received my cohort and consumed the majority of us, before spitting the survivors back into the transport holds for transit to the next war zone. The list grew, the stirring deepened, and I began to understand, in ways I could not articulate even to myself, that something was growing inside me that the scholar had failed to remove, something fragile and dangerous and utterly incompatible with the function I had been designed to serve. I did not know what to call it then. I know now. I know it was humanity, buried but not dead, suppressed but not destroyed, waiting in the darkness of my conditioning for the moment when it would finally claw its way back into the light. That moment would come. It would take decades, would cost more lives than I can count, would require horrors I still cannot speak of, without feeling that tightness in my chest that I first experienced on Carthex Minoris. But it would come. And when it did, everything I had been built to be would come apart, and I would have to decide what to construct from the wreckage. The years became a blur of worlds and wars, and the steady accumulation of names that I carried in the silence of my skull. I fought on Carthex Minoris until the rebels were broken. I fought on Strovan 7th against orcs whose savagery made the human insurrectionists seem gentle by comparison. I fought on Chalice Prime against a cult that worshipped things I was not permitted to understand, whose rituals I witnessed in the depths of underground temples, and whose practitioners I killed with a fury that surprised even myself. Some fragment of my conditioning, recognizing in their practices a corruption so profound that it deserved not merely death, but annihilation. I fought on worlds whose names have been stricken from imperial records, against enemies whose existence has been classified at levels that ensure no one will ever speak of them, in campaigns that lasted weeks or months or years, and left behind nothing but corpses and the hollow-eyed survivors who would be shipped to the next battlefield before the blood had dried on their uniforms. I was 15 when I made my first kill with my bare hands. The details do not matter. The world, the enemy, the specific circumstances that left me without ammunition in a room with a man who wanted me dead. What matters is what I felt when my fingers closed around his throat and I watched the life drain from his eyes, when I felt his struggles weaken and then cease, and then give way to the particular stillness that only corpses possess. I felt satisfaction, not the cold efficiency that had characterized my previous kills, not the mechanical completion of a task that had been assigned to me, but genuine satisfaction, pleasure even, in the act of ending another human being's existence with nothing between us but skin and bone, and the raw animal reality of predator and prey. This should have horrified me. The scholar's training should have prevented such feelings, should have kept my emotional responses within the narrow band that was considered acceptable for functional soldiers. But I had learned by then that the training was not perfect, that the conditioning had cracks through which things seeped, not just the grief-like stirring I had felt since Carthex Minoris, but darker things as well, hungers and satisfactions that the scholar had not anticipated and would not have approved of if they had known. I told no one. I buried it alongside the names, alongside the stirring, alongside everything else that made me different from the weapon I was supposed to be. The cohorts I served with changed constantly, faces cycling through my peripheral vision, like components in a machine that was always breaking down and always being repaired with fresh parts from the manufacturums of 1,000 worlds. I stopped learning names after Carthex Minoris, stopped allowing myself to recognize the individuals who fought beside me as anything other than temporary arrangements of flesh that would soon be rearranged by enemy fire or explosive decompression, or the 1,000 other ways that soldiers died in the Emperor's service. This was protection. I understood even then. Protection against the stirring, against the weight of names that grew heavier with each campaign, against the humanity that lurked beneath my conditioning and threatened to drown me if I allowed myself to feel the full scope of loss that my existence entailed. But I could not protect myself from everything. Her designation was Vel 9, and she should have been nothing to me. Just another face in just another cohort on just another world whose name I have deliberately forgotten. She was young, perhaps 14, fresh from a scholar on a forge world whose name she spoke with an accent I had never heard before. She was assigned to my squad during the 3rd week of a campaign that had already consumed most of the soldiers I had deployed with, and she fought beside me for 6 months, before the artillery barrage that killed her and 17 others, in a single instant of fire and thunder, and the particular wet sound of human bodies being torn apart by forces they were never designed to withstand. I should not have noticed her. I should not have learned her name. But there was something in the way she moved, something in the way she held her weapon, something in the slight hesitation before each kill that told me she felt the stirring too, that she carried her own list of names, her own burden of humanity that the conditioning had failed to fully suppress. I recognized myself in her. I saw in her eyes the same questions that I had been asking in the silence of my own mind for years, the same doubt, the same growing awareness that what we were doing was not merely duty, but something else, something that required a reckoning that neither of us knew how to perform. We spoke sometimes in the brief moments between engagements when the noise of the war faded enough to allow for conversation, not about important things. We did not have the vocabulary for important things, did not possess the framework that might allow us to articulate the growing unease that we both felt. We spoke about weapons and tactics and the specific characteristics of the enemies we faced, about ration quality and ammunition counts, and the endless small details that filled the lives of soldiers who had never been taught to think about anything larger than the next mission. But beneath those conversations, transmitted in glances and silences, and the particular way she would look at me when another member of our squad fell, was something else. An acknowledgement, a recognition, a shared understanding that we were both carrying burdens that we could not name and could not set down. She died on a Tuesday. I know this because I had begun tracking the days by then, had developed my own system for measuring time that went beyond the mission cycle designations that the Militarum used. She died on a Tuesday, and I was less than 10 meters away when the shells landed, and I watched her body come apart in ways that I will not describe, because some images should not be translated into words, should not be given the permanence that language provides, should be allowed to remain in the private darkness of memory, where they can fade and soften and eventually become bearable. I added her name to my list, Vel 9, the first name I had allowed myself to learn since Carthex Minoris, and something in me cracked. Not broke, I did not break, did not cease to function, did not require the Commissariat's attention or the Medicare's intervention. I continued to fight, continued to kill, continued to survive through engagements that claimed everyone around me with the same reliability that had characterized my entire career. But the crack was there, visible only to me, a fissure in the architecture of my conditioning through which light was beginning to seep. Not the harsh light of the Imperium's truth, but something softer, something warmer, something that whispered of possibilities I had never been taught to imagine. I began to dream. This was new, was wrong, was a malfunction that the scholar's conditioning should have prevented. Soldiers were not supposed to dream. The chemical supplements in our rations and the psycho-conditioning of our training were designed to ensure that our sleep was empty, was merely the necessary recharging of biological systems that could not function without periodic unconsciousness. But I dreamed now, every night, visions that made no sense and followed no logic, but carried emotional weight that left me gasping when I woke, my chest tight with feelings I could not identify, my mind filled with images of faces I had never seen and places I had never visited, and a life that bore no resemblance to the one I had actually lived. In the dreams, I had a mother. In the dreams, I had a name. Not a designation, not a number, but an actual name that someone had chosen for me because they loved me and wanted me to carry something of them into the future. In the dreams, I was a child who played and laughed and cried when I was hurt, who was comforted and protected, and taught that the universe was not merely a machine for processing human beings into useful components. In the dreams, I was human in a way that I had never been permitted to be human in my waking life. I woke from those dreams with tears on my face. I did not know why I was crying. I did not know what tears were for. I was 23 years old. I had been fighting for 11 years. I had killed more human beings than I could count, had watched more comrades die than I could remember, had participated in campaigns that would have broken soldiers from softer backgrounds within hours of deployment. And I was dreaming of a mother I had never known, weeping for a childhood I had never experienced, feeling things that the scholar had assured me I was incapable of feeling. The crack was widening. The humanity that had been buried beneath my conditioning was clawing its way toward the surface. And I understood, with a clarity that terrified me, that I could not continue as I was, could not keep fighting and killing and surviving, while the thing inside me grew stronger with each passing day. Something was going to break. Either the conditioning would reassert itself and crush the stirring back into the darkness where it belonged, or the humanity would emerge fully, and I would have to confront what I had become, and what I had done, and what the Imperium had made of me since the moment of my birth. I did not know which outcome I feared more. I did not know which outcome I hoped for. I knew only that the dreams were getting stronger, that Vel-9's name echoed in my skull alongside all the others, that the weapon I had been built to be was developing flaws that could not be repaired by the standard maintenance protocols. I was breaking, slowly, quietly, in ways that no one could see but me. And the war continued regardless, grinding forward across worlds without number, consuming children like fuel, producing soldiers like products, caring nothing for the cracks that formed in the instruments it wielded, or the humanity that stirred in the souls it had tried so hard to destroy. I was 23 years old. I had 18 more years of war ahead of me before the breaking would finally be complete. The world was called Theraxis Secundus, and it was a hive world like the one where I had been born. I did not realize this at first, did not recognize the architecture or the smell or the particular quality of desperation that hung in the recycled air of the underhive levels where we had been deployed. But as the campaign ground forward through its third month, as I moved through hab blocks and manufacturum districts, and the endless cramped warrens where the lowest citizens of the Imperium lived and worked and died without ever seeing natural light, something began to stir in me that went beyond the usual stirring. A recognition, a resonance, a sense of terrible familiarity that I could not explain and could not ignore. I was 41 years old. I had been fighting for 29 years. The mission was suppression. Another cult, another uprising, another population that had turned against the Imperium's authority for reasons that we were not told and did not need to know. The enemy wore civilian clothes and hid among civilian populations, which meant that the distinction between combatant and non-combatant had become meaningless, which meant that we killed everyone who might be a threat and let the Emperor sort the innocent from the guilty in whatever afterlife awaited the souls we dispatched. This was standard protocol. This was how such campaigns were always conducted. I had participated in dozens of similar operations across my decades of service, had learned to suppress whatever fragments of doubt might arise when my laser gun found targets that did not carry weapons, that did not resist, that simply stood in the wrong place at the wrong time and paid for that coincidence with their lives. But Thraxis was different. Thraxis broke something that had been bending for 18 years. We were clearing a hab block in the deepest levels of the Underhive, a structure so old and so poorly maintained that its walls were slick with condensation, and its floors buckled beneath our boots, and its ceilings sagged with the weight of the city pressing down from above. The residents had fled, or been evacuated, or been killed in the initial assault. I did not know which, did not care which, focused only on the room-by-room sweep that our orders required, and the targets that our intelligence suggested were hiding somewhere within the structure's labyrinthine corridors. I found the children in a storage chamber on the 7th sublevel. There were 12 of them, huddled together in the darkness between crates of nutrient paste and drums of recycled water, their eyes wide with terror as my stab lamp illuminated their hiding place. The oldest might have been 10. The youngest was still an infant, held in the arms of a girl who could not have been more than 6. Her thin arms wrapped around the baby, with a fierceness that suggested she understood exactly what was about to happen, and had decided to face it without letting go of the only thing she had left to protect. They were not combatants. They were not threats. They were simply children, surplus population of an underhive that had been designated for cleansing, small lives that had been caught in the machinery of imperial justice through no fault of their own. My training told me what to do. My orders were clear. No witnesses, no survivors, no one who might carry word of the cult's teachings or serve as a seed from which the insurrection might regrow. I had followed such orders 1,000 times before, had put down targets younger than these without allowing myself to feel anything beyond the cold satisfaction of duty completed. The weapon I had been built to be knew exactly how to handle this situation. 12 trigger pulls, 12 small bodies cooling in the darkness, 12 problems solved with the efficiency that the scholar had drilled into me since before I could walk. I raised my laser gun. The girl with the infant looked at me, not with pleading, not with the desperate hope that I might show mercy. She was too young to understand mercy, had been raised in conditions that did not include such concepts in their vocabulary. She looked at me with acceptance, with a resignation so complete that it made her seem ancient despite her years, with the understanding that this was simply how the universe worked, and there was no point in struggling against forces so vast that individual lives meant nothing at all. I saw myself in her eyes. I saw the child I had been, huddled in a scholar dormitory, waiting for the training that would strip away everything that made me human. I saw Vel 9 before the artillery took her, carrying her own burden of names and questions and humanity that the conditioning had failed to destroy. I saw every child soldier I had ever served beside, every face that had cycled through my peripheral vision across 29 years of unending war, every small body that had been processed by the Imperium's machinery and expended in the Emperor's service without hesitation or remorse. I saw what the Imperium had made of me. I saw what I had become, and I could not pull the trigger. My finger was on the firing stud. My weapon was aimed. Every fragment of my training screamed at me to complete the mission, to follow orders, to be the weapon I had been built to be. But my hand would not move. My body would not obey. Something had seized control of my muscles, had interposed itself between intention and action, had finally, after all these years, broken through the conditioning that had governed my existence since the moment of my decanting from whatever woman's womb had produced me in the depths of a hive world just like this one. I lowered my laser gun. The girl continued to stare at me, her arms still wrapped around the infant, her face still carrying that terrible acceptance that no child should ever have to learn. The other children had not moved, had not made a sound, their terror so complete that it had transcended expression and become simply a state of being. "Go," I said, and my voice emerged as a cracked and broken thing, a whisper that barely qualified as speech. "There is a drainage access at the end of this corridor. It leads to the lower sumps. They will not search there. Go now, and do not stop until you have put at least 3 levels between yourself and this place." The girl did not move. She did not understand. Children in the underhive did not receive mercy. They received processing, received classification, received assignment to whatever track the authorities determined would make best use of their biological resources. The concept of an adult with a weapon choosing not to fire was so foreign to her experience that she could not process it, could not integrate it into her understanding of how the universe functioned. "Go," I said again, and this time I reached down and pulled her to her feet, my hands gentle in a way they had not been gentle since. Since when? Since ever? Had I ever touched another human being with gentleness rather than violence? I could not remember. I could not recall a single instance in my 41 years of existence when my hands had been instruments of anything other than death. The girl finally moved, pulling the other children with her, herding them toward the drainage access with a competence that spoke of experience beyond her years. She paused at the threshold, looked back at me one final time, and for a moment I thought she might speak, might say something that would make sense of what had just happened, that would explain why a soldier of the Imperium had chosen to let her live. She said nothing. She simply disappeared into the darkness, the infant still clutched against her chest, the other children following in a silent line that vanished into the depths of the hive, like water draining through cracks in a broken vessel. I stood alone in the storage chamber, my laser gun hanging loose in hands that had begun to shake with a tremor I could not control. I had disobeyed orders. I had allowed enemy assets, for that is what the children were, in the cold calculus of the campaign, to escape. I had committed a sin against everything the scholar had built me to be, had violated the conditioning that had governed my existence since before I could form conscious memories, had finally and irrevocably broken the weapon that the Imperium had spent 41 years forging from the raw material of a motherless infant in the depths of Vulgaris Primus. The breaking was complete. The humanity had won. And I understood, standing there in the darkness with the ghost echo of children's footsteps fading in my ears, that I could never go back, could never return to being the thing I had been, could never again raise my weapon against a target without asking the questions that the scholar had forbidden me to ask. The conditioning was shattered. The programming was corrupted beyond repair. Whatever I was now, whatever I would become, I was no longer the soldier that the Imperium had designed me to be. I should have reported myself. I should have confessed my failure to the commissar, accepted the bolt round that awaited those who could not perform their function. Let my death serve as a lesson to others who might feel their conditioning beginning to crack. This was the protocol. This was what the scholar had taught us to do when we detected malfunction in ourselves. Report it, accept correction, allow the system to process us out so that we would not contaminate others with our defects. But I wanted to live. This was the final betrayal, the ultimate proof that the humanity inside me had grown stronger than everything the Imperium had tried to build. I wanted to live, not as a weapon, not as an instrument of death, not as a component in a machine that processed children into soldiers and soldiers into corpses, but as something else, something I did not have a name for, something that the girl with the infant had awakened in me when she looked into my eyes and saw whatever it was she saw. I walked out of the Hab block. I filed a report claiming the structure had been clear. I continued to serve for another 2 months until the campaign was declared complete and our regiment was withdrawn for redeployment. And then I disappeared. Not through death, not through official discharge, not through any of the channels that the Militarum had established for processing soldiers out of service. I simply stopped being where I was supposed to be, stopped appearing for musters, stopped existing in the records that tracked the components of the Emperor's war machine. I became a ghost, a deserter, a defect that had removed itself from the system rather than waiting for the system to remove it. I do not know what happened to the girl and the other children. I do not know if they survived the drainage sumps, if they found their way to safety, if they lived long enough to grow into whatever kind of adults the Underhive produces from the raw material of its surplus youth. I hope they did. I pray they did, though I no longer know who I am praying to, or whether prayers from someone like me have any power to affect the universe. I know only that I let them go. I know only that I chose, for the first time in 41 years, to be something other than what I had been made to be. I know only that the weapon finally broke, and what remained in the wreckage was something that might be worthy of being called human. This was 10 years ago. 10 years of hiding, of running, of building a life in the margins of the Imperium, where deserters and defects and other broken things find whatever shelter they can from the machinery that produced them. 10 years of learning what it means to be something other than ammunition. 10 years of carrying the names. I am 51 years old, and I am still learning how to be human. This is the truth that I have carried with me through 10 years of hiding. 10 years of building a life in the spaces between the Imperium's attention. 10 years of waking each morning and choosing, consciously, deliberately, for the first time in my existence, what I will do with the hours that stretch before me. The choice itself is still strange, still foreign, still a luxury so profound that I sometimes catch myself waiting for an officer to appear and tell me where to go and what to kill, and how to spend the biological resources that the scholar trained me to view as the Imperium's property, rather than my own. No officer comes, no orders arrive. I am alone with my choices, and the weight of that freedom is heavier than any burden I carried across 29 years of war. I live in the underhive of a world whose name I will not speak, in a hab block not unlike the one where I was born, among people who ask no questions about the scars that cover my body, or the emptiness that sometimes fills my eyes when memory drags me back to places I would rather forget. They are surplus population, the forgotten and the discarded, the human beings who exist in the margins of imperial society because the machinery above has no use for them and has not yet found it convenient to process them into something more useful. They do not know what I was. They do not know what I did. They know only that I am quiet, that I keep to myself, that I sometimes help with tasks that require strength or skill, and ask for nothing in return except the simple privilege of being allowed to exist among them. This is enough. This has to be enough. I work in a recycling facility now, sorting salvage that descends from the upper hives in great cascading avalanches of broken machinery and discarded goods, and the detritus of a civilization that produces waste on scales too vast for comprehension. The work is hard, and the pay is minimal, and the conditions would be considered intolerable by anyone who had not been raised in the schola laborum of Vulgoris Primus, where comfort was a concept as foreign as mercy, and exhaustion was simply the state in which one existed between periods of unconsciousness. I find peace in the labor, find something like purpose in the simple act of taking broken things and sorting them into categories that allow them to be remade into something useful. There is a poetry in this, I think, a broken thing working to process other broken things, finding meaning in the transformation of waste into material that might serve some purpose beyond the one for which it was originally designed. I still carry the names. They come to me at night, in the darkness of the small chamber I have claimed as my own, rising unbidden from the depths of memory where I have stored them across 4 decades of war and 10 years of peace. Mira 7, Kale 12, Sev 3, Vel 9, and all the others, hundreds of others, thousands of others, designations that replaced names because the scholar did not believe that children being processed into weapons deserved anything so human as a name. I speak them aloud sometimes, in the quiet hours when the hab block sleeps and no one can hear the strange liturgy I perform. A recitation of the dead, a prayer for souls that were expended before they had a chance to become anything other than ammunition, a refusal to let them disappear entirely into the vast, indifferent machinery that consumed them. I do not know if this matters. I do not know if the dead can hear me, or if the universe cares about the small rituals I perform in their memory. But I know that I was there. I know that I witnessed. I know that someone should speak their names, even if that someone is a broken deserter hiding in the depths of a hive world, even if the speaking changes nothing and reaches no one and serves no purpose beyond the simple act of remembering. The Imperium continues without me. This is the truth that I must accept each day when I wake and choose to continue existing, rather than surrendering myself to the authorities who would process me as the defect that I am. Across 10,000 worlds, the machinery grinds on. Children are born in the billions, sorted and classified and assigned to tracks that will determine everything about their brief and brutal lives, shaped into weapons or workers or servitors, according to needs that exist on scales so vast that individual souls become meaningless, become statistics, become numbers in ledgers that no one will ever read. The schola laborum still operates on Vulgoris Primus. The cohorts still ship out to war zones whose names they will never know. The cycle continues, has always continued, will continue long after I am dead and forgotten. And the hab block where I hide has collapsed into the lower depths under the weight of the city pressing down from above. I cannot stop it. I could not stop it even if I tried. But I can refuse to participate. I can choose, each day, to be something other than what they made me. I can live as proof that the conditioning is not perfect, that the machinery has flaws, that somewhere in the depths of even the most thoroughly processed weapon, there remains a fragment of humanity that cannot be entirely destroyed. This is my rebellion. This is my defiance. This is the only victory available to me, and I claim it not with weapons or violence, but with the simple act of continuing to exist as something other than what the Imperium designed me to be. I think often of the girl with the infant, the child who looked at me with such terrible acceptance in that storage chamber on Theraxis Secundus. I do not know her name. She did not have a name, any more than I did, any more than any of the surplus children of the Underhive possess names in the eyes of the systems that process them. But I carry her face with me, alongside all the others, and I hope, I pray, that somewhere in the depths of whatever hive swallowed her, She is still alive, still carrying the infant she refused to release, still existing as proof that the machinery does not always consume everything it touches. Perhaps she has found her own peace. Perhaps she has built her own life in the margins. Perhaps she has learned, as I am learning, that humanity cannot be entirely stripped away, that it survives in the cracks of even the most brutal conditioning, waiting for the moment when it can emerge and begin the slow work of reconstruction. I was raised as a child soldier on a hive world. I was processed by systems designed to transform me into a weapon, stripped of name and family and everything that might make me more than a component in the Imperium's war machine. I killed more human beings than I can count, watched more comrades die than I can remember, participated in horrors that I still cannot speak of without feeling the weight of them pressing down upon my chest, like the weight of the city pressing down upon the hab block where I hide. And I am still here. I am still breathing. I am still choosing, each day, to be something other than what they made me. This is not redemption. I do not believe in redemption. Not for someone who has done what I have done. Not for hands that have taken as many lives as mine have taken. The blood does not wash away. The names do not stop echoing in the darkness. The guilt is a companion that walks beside me through every hour of every day, reminding me of what I was, what I did, what I allowed myself to become in the name of duty and conditioning and the simple, overwhelming need to survive. But perhaps redemption is not the point. Perhaps the point is simply continuation. The refusal to let the machinery have the final word. The insistence on existing as something other than the weapon they designed. The small and quiet rebellion of a broken soldier who learned, too late, that there was a human being buried beneath the conditioning all along. I am 51 years old. I was raised as ammunition, expended across 29 years of war, discarded when I finally broke in, the way that ammunition is discarded when it fails to fire. But I am not ammunition anymore. I am human, broken, scarred, haunted by names that will follow me to my grave, but human nonetheless. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where children are processed into weapons and weapons are expended without thought or hesitation, that small truth is the only victory I have left to claim. I claim it. I hold it. I refuse to let it go. And tomorrow, when I wake, I will choose again to be something other than what they made me. This is what it means to survive the scholar. This is what it costs to be raised as a child soldier of the Imperium. This is what remains when the weapon finally breaks and the human being inside begins the long, slow work of learning how to live.